What's up, Star Wars Unlimited fans? Today we will have a chat about Han Solo, Worth the Risk. First things first, matters vary, but personally I think that the blue version of Han is the strongest one at this point of time, because we have a very good unit selection from the aggression side of things, while simultaneously some of the best removal in the game by having access to vigilance. When it comes to removal specifically though, I think the hardest part when building a top tier Han Solo deck, because you want to have enough removal so that you can play a mid-range plan, so you can work your way up to bigger units while not just straight up dying to aggro, but simultaneously you want to have enough units in the deck so that you don't just keep on drawing into removal pieces. Personally, I think the sweet spot is maximum 12 control cards. Running 11 pieces is probably more optimal than 12 though, because it gives us a 79% chance to draw into at least one of them in our opening hand without a mulligan. Simultaneously, we have an 89% chance to draw into one by turn 2, a 94% chance by turn 3. We only have a 6% chance that we don't draw into any of them at all, so I think that's a very good spot to be in, so we can just focus on the good units and nothing else. When it comes to removal pieces, I think Carabas to make an opening, open fire, Krayt Dragon takedown are the better ones. Make an opening is probably the least popular one among these, but if you have a combination of any of these, then you should have a very good base to build around. But again, just include 11 of these, don't go over that, I think it's too much. There are some decks out there that are running Force Throw. Technically, you could run that over some of your removal cards, but then I suggest to increasing your event count up to 12 instead of 11, so that you still have 9 dedicated removal pieces left in the deck. That way, you'll have approximately an 11% chance that on turn 3 you don't have a removal in hand. But since we do have some units in the deck as well that help us remove stuff, it doesn't become that much of a problem. In an aggro-heavy meta though, I don't think Force Throw is all that good. I think Force Throw is especially good if you're up against control decks, because they like to resource a lot. They have less cards in hand, and usually if you Force Throw them in the late game, then you can burn them for quite a significant chunk of damage. Han's arrow ability deals damage to our units, allowing us to discount them by 1 and allowing us then to sneak stuff into the arena early. I think to build an optimal Han, we kind of want to run a mix of the best units in the game at this point of time. If I'm looking at the card pool right now though, I think the ground arena has a higher concentration of good units, so while you do want to run a couple of space units, I do think when it comes to ground versus space, you want to have roughly a 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1 ratio. This gives you a solid basis to continue to dominate the ground arena, while still giving you some leeway to play stuff in space. I think the Green Squadron A-Wing is a solid 3 damage attacker that can sometimes even run away with the game by just continuously attacking if the opponent doesn't have anything else going on in space, while also being able to clear some of the 2-3s that the opponent might have and getting you a 2-for-1 trade. Conquer Down Interceptors is great, though it has 3 power when it's defending. It's not great as an attacker, but you can get this one onto the board as early as turn 1 thanks to Han's ability. And then if your opponent is playing in the space arena, then you have a 3-2 defender with Sentinel that they have to attack into, so it's a very easy 1-for-1 trade. While simultaneously, if you do play this one on turn 2, you can make it a 2-for-1 trade. Conquer Down Interceptors is not that great against control strategies, so if you do end up against control deck, it's better to side this one out in games 2 and 3. And then finally, we have the Redemption Medical Frigate. This one is expensive, but if we drop it down in the late game, we get a huge heal on our base, and then we also have a tremendous body left behind that can attack in and sometimes win us the game. I would say, depending on the meta that you're facing, you can run 3 of each of these, or there might even be something to be said that you don't run any at all, and you just use your removal event cards to keep the space arena clear. It's all up to you. I think running a couple is usually a good choice. So when it comes to other 2-drops, the A-Wing is a given, and another card that a lot of players like to play is Sabine. However, both A-Wing and Sabine have a bit of an issue. A-Wing is a 1-3, while Sabine is a 2-3. While these are great attackers, if you're up against a Sabine player that knows what they're doing and they do have a ECL ready to go, sometimes when you deploy one of these, they will ECL a 3-3 onto the board, clearing your unit while leaving their unit behind. And when that happens, you're in trouble because they have had a beneficial trade, leaving a unit behind, which you then need to deal with, and then you end up in a game of whack-a-mole where once you are done dealing with a unit, they already have another one deployed and ready to attack in, leaking in damage every single turn and making it very awkward. So because of this, if you're in a meta where there are a lot of Sabine players, I think it's worth considering to not play the A-Wing and also to cut the Sabines out altogether, and looking for some other solid 3-drops to play with Han's ability instead that have 3 power on their own, so that if they do try to trade, it's a 1-for-1 trade and they don't leave anything behind, because otherwise they're just going to win by leaking true damage. Cassian in this example is an odd to include in that regard, because even with the 2 damage it leaves a 3-3 behind. It has smuggle, so it's also good in the late game as a surprise attacker that can steal you the game. But even then, since it's a 3-3, sometimes the opponent will deploy something like a 1-2 or 2-3 themselves, and if you attack those with Cassian, then you have already one thing off the board and you still have a decent body left on the field for them to deal with, or potentially attack into something else within a follow-up turn. But Cassian alone is not gonna win you games, right? I think another card that is quite as a raw shield 3 tender is a 2-4 by itself, but it does have grit, so if you deploy with Han's ability as a 4-2, then if your opponent does swing something into it, it's at least a 1-for-1 trade again. Another alternative that you could run in space over the A-Wing will be a mercenary gunship. Well, it only has 2 health, it does have 3 power on its own, and the opponent can steal it, but usually by the time that they are able to steal it, you've already attacked into something with it to clear it. So you could run this over the A-Wing if you do want to have a dedicated attacker in space, to have a little bit of a in-between plan if you're not really sure. Personally though, I think to conquer down interceptors alongside the Frigate is usually enough, especially since we do run 11 removal pieces in the deck already. When it comes to other 3-drops, Tech and Yoda are great cards to include in your deck. Yoda is great because it has to restore 2, while Tech helps you to gain card advantage by playing stuff out of your resources. I don't think it's a good idea to play these with Han's ability though. You want these to be as healthy as possible so that you can gain as much advantage out of them, either by smuggling cards onto the board or by attacking with Yoda to get multiple heals off. Sometimes it even forces the opponent to waste multiple attacks into these, and if they do, you can kind of see like a pseudo heal, like let's say if they attack it twice for 3 damage, right, then you're technically healing 6 damage, maybe you're able to attack with Yoda once, healing an additional 2 damage, then you have 8 value, not even considering the damage that Yoda is dealing itself. So there are some cool things you can do with these cards, but don't Han Solo ability them into play, because that's just bad value. For the 4-drops, Baze Malbus is great. It has grit, it has 4 health by itself, so if you deploy with Han's ability, have a very decent 4-3 attacker that has Sentinel if you claim initiative right afterwards. So sometimes you get into some really interesting situations where the opponent has a big board of ground units that they are planning to attack in with. You deploy Baze Malbus with Han's ability, and then after claim the initiatives, now your opponent has to deal with the Baze Malbus or they need to pass the turn, and then you can usually gain a little bit of momentum back. K2SO doesn't really provide much for the deck in terms of utility, but it has a solid body. It's a 4-4 that, if it attacks in, can overwhelm some units and still dealing some damage to the opponent base. Well, simultaneously, if it does get defeated, you are guaranteed at least 3 damage to the base as well, so that's kind of nice. I do think in the future, though, that this is a card I might be wanting to cut out of this deck. It's great in green decks where you can overwhelm ECL this one into play, but in this deck, it doesn't feel too good. I just don't think there's any good replacement at the moment to run instead of this. Kanan Jarrus is a Force unit, so it has some synergy with things like Obi-Wan or even the Force Throw. But this is kind of like a restore unit, because when it attacks in, you get to discard cards from the top of your opponent's deck equal to the number of specters that you have, which is usually 1 in this case, because it's very rare that you still have Sabine alive at this point of time. You have a very strong body that continuously keeps restoring the base for you, is just very good. Currently, I'm running a 5-drop Dameron in the deck. Dameron is a great card, but when you're not running green, it's a little bit awkward, because doesn't do anything when you actually play the card. You need to attack in with it, and because we're in red and blue, we don't have a real way to ambush with this card, so usually if you do play with Han's ability, it's just a vanilla 6-4 that the opponent ends up dealing with rather easily. It That said, the stat line is very good, especially if you compare it to other cards in the game, and it does force your opponent to deal with it, so in that way it can sometimes buy you a turn. I do wonder though if this card is a good fit for a Han blue deck though. It's much better in the green version of the deck, but at the moment I don't think there's a good alternative. Maybe Rey would be a good fit in here instead, but I personally don't think Rey is all that good of a card, even though it's a force unit, so it does have some synergy with our other cards. I don't think it's good enough, so for now I'm just going to continue running Poe instead. Obi-Wan and Wrecker on the other hand have less issues like Poe does, because Obi-Wan is a dedicated sentinel. If you have another force unit in the arena, then when Obi-Wan gets defeated you get to put some experience counters on that one as well, so the value is just all around good with this card. And then simultaneously with Wrecker, if you play it, you get to destroy one of your resources and get rid of a problematic ground unit that your opponent might have, so both of these are just really good. Our dedicated 7-drop is gonna be Luke Skywalker. This one is great as a removal card as well. You can play it as a 6 cost thanks to Han, so you have the -3/-3 removal guaranteed. But what makes this especially good is because we're constantly trading cards with the opponent, most of the time this is gonna generate you 8-6, so this can remove pretty much any unit in the game at this point of time, at least at that point into the game. And then on top of that it has Restore 3, so once this starts attacking in, not only are you dealing a ton of damage with it, you're also healing your base, which is just absolutely amazing. Chewbacca is a very huge grid attacker, 410 grid, which would already be very nicely costed at 8 cost, but the fact that it also has a removal effect built into it is just pure genius. If you play this one on turn 6, this is usually going to run away with the game, unless the opponent has a dedicated removal card ready to roll. But against anything that is not blue, this card is just so ridiculously strong because you play it as a 6/8 attacker. If they attack into it, it only gets stronger, so if they attack into it once, you can even deal an absolute ton of damage into the base with it. And it's even very thematic because Chewbacca and Han, they kind of go hand in hand, right? So I'm very happy with this card. I think it's one of the strongest cards in the deck, honestly. Mace Windu is another card that not all decks run, but you can deploy it on turn 5, kill a thing with the ambush, and then start attacking the base. It's yet another card that easily generates you a 2-for-1 value where you remove one of their things, and then they need to bash something into it to get it off the board, so it's just a valuable card to have. I do think though that having too many Mace Windus can be a bit awkward at times, but you can always just have one of these in the main board and then just keep 2 of them in the sideboard for matchups that are more unit heavy, like the aggro ones where you want to remove multiple things. There are a lot of control matchups though that despite our early curve and big creatures, they are just going to continuously keep removing them. If we look at decks like Darth Vader for example, it's very hard to have a board state at all. So there's no way to really have a good win con, but cards like Krayt Dragon do help us to sneak in damage because we play it, they need to deal with it because if they don't, they're gonna take 10 damage to the base. If you play Krayt Dragon at a time where you have a bunch of units on the board already, it makes it very awkward for control players to play something like a Super Laser Blast because if they do so, they need to take a ton of damage from playing that card. And if they don't do that, they need to take a ton of damage from you attacking it with all your units. So I do think that Krayt Dragon is a very interesting card in this deck. It's not as good in the blue version of Han as it is in the green one. In the green version, you can end up playing this very early on in the game. In the blue version, it takes a while before you can put this one down. But it does give you an out against control decks specifically, where in the early game you try to sneak a bit of damage in here and there. And then once they have stabilized, you just try to play Krayt Dragons back to back that they need to end, so while simultaneously taking a chunk of damage. Sometimes you can even play this one and then claim the initiative. And then if you do, during your turn, you can just attack for 10. And then if they do remove it with something like Felder Dragon, they're still taking 4 damage and then you have at least a 14 value out of this card. So right now on the screen I'm showing an overview of all the cards that I think are good in this deck. This is not a deck by the way, I'm going to show you that in a minute. But I think buying play sets of these shown on the screen right now is a good place to start if you're interested. It's a bit expensive though, since you do need to have a play set of Poe Damerons and Krayt Dragons, which are very pricey at this point of time. but I do think this deck is just going to continue to be strong even in the future. Just discounting effects in general, it doesn't matter what TCG you're playing, they are going to remain relevant and they only get stronger over time as we get access to stronger and stronger units. So I do think that Han is a good deck to have in general. Against a control or mid-range meta, I would run the deck as shown on the screen right now. Some neat low-cost attackers that can attack in the early game, and then once you're in the late game, you can start throwing your Krayt Dragons down, and you can even play something like a Force Throw here and there to force an expensive card out of your opponent's hand and dealing a ton of damage that way. Against an aggro-centric meta though, I would trim down some of the cheaper pieces. I run the deck more like this, with 3 power attackers that I mentioned earlier. It just gives you a far better trade-off against those decks, especially Sabine. But all in all, this was a really fun hero to explore. At first I thought this was gonna be the most broken hero ever if you pair it with the green base. However, after playing the green version for a while, I do know that there's a significant amount of consistency issues. So I do think that the blue version of Han is just much better and far more consistent. If you enjoyed today's analysis video, please let me know down in the comments down below and subscribe to the channel for more Star Wars content. Work on content for various card games full-time. Unfortunately, that does mean that my ad revenue is quite limited because TCGs are a bit of a niche market when it comes to producing content over on YouTube. Because of this, I'm dependent on donations from viewers like yourself. I know money is hard to earn, especially in the economy that we are in today. But if you're ever in a position that you would like to help me out, you can do so by becoming a channel member or patron over on patreon.com/Kugane Gaming. I'm even working on some Star Wars Unlimited playmats right now, like the one shown on the screen. I will have digital files of these available in my $10 and up tiers on Patreon. So if you want a cool Star Wars Unlimited playmat, you can check that out. There will be some uploaded there that you can then print for your personal use. With that said, I hope this video was useful to you. I hope you have a lovely day and to see you again in my next TCG video. Take care.